Welcome to the seventh installment of this beginner series into game development with Unreal Engine 4. Today we will be looking into user interfaces, specifically widgets and UMG, which is called Unreal Motion Graphics, sometimes interchangeably. We will be going through and creating a very simple widget and explaining a little bit how the interface for that works. And we will go through some better than normal practices so you avoid some of the more common missteps that people do when it comes to widgets. So let's get started. We will be using Unreal version 4.26 today, and we are continuing from our previous tutorial, which is a first-person template. It has starter content installed if you want to follow along today. So the first thing that we want to do is to right-click over here, go to User Interface. Under here we have the option of a widget blueprint. Now, naming convention when it comes to widgets, I would suggest you start with a W, then underscore and the name of the widget. So today we'll be calling it HUD, which stands for Heads Up Display. This is because we will make a single widget that will encompass the whole screen for the player, but normally what you could do is you have possibly one widget that represents the HUDs, and then you have multiple other widgets for each separate element that you want to add into that HUD. So you can make a widget for your health bar, and another widget for your mana bar, and a different widget for a portrait or a picture, and another widget for some kind of radar or something along those lines. So there is a lot to expand upon widgets and user interfaces, but we will just be taking some of the more basic steps today and get you acquainted with it. So let's start up with opening up our widget blueprint. And then we'll dock it up here in the top. Okay, so let's go through the different elements we have available to us. In the top left we have the palette. The palette allows us to pick different predefined components that we can use to put in our work area, which is in the middle of the screen here. So this could be things like buttons. You can drag and drop them if you want to. There can be images, there can be sliders and texts, progress bars, all kinds of different elements that you can put into your canvas, as it's called, and then you change the properties of each component that you put in here to make it a certain style and change it so it has the look that you want. So we'll be removing these for now. In addition to these normal common components, there are some specific ones for different types of categories, and also you have the tab, which will be more relevant later on as you get more acquainted with this, which is the user created. So this is the category where your own widgets would show up under. So if you had made a widget that was called health bar, this is where you could find it, and then you could just drop it in here. So for our purposes, again, we're going to keep it basic. We're going to keep everything in this widget, so it's simple, but in later user interface tutorials, I'm sure we can delve into some more interesting ways of handling this. In addition to the palette in the top left, we also have the hierarchy in the middle left. The hierarchy is your sort of file structure or object structure when it comes to your different components. So if you were to have, for example, a button and drag it into your canvas, you see that it appears over here in your hierarchy, and it's subservient right now to the canvas panel. So the button belongs to the canvas. But then if we were to drag something like a text in, we can drag and drop it on top of the button, and that would allow the hierarchy to understand, okay, you want to have the button as the parent or the owner of the text block, which means that if you change where the button is, for example, if you change the X position here, you see that the text that belongs to it will follow along. So the hierarchy allows you to put in complexity when it comes to relationships between different components. This can be very useful, but for today we will keep it rather simple. So we will remove these elements again. Next we have, and this may or may not show on your editor depending on how it's set up, but in the bottom left we have animation, and connected to that we also have a little bit to the right the timeline window. These two in conjunction allow you to use keyframes like we spoke about earlier when it comes to timelines. Ways for you to keyframe different components and then allow them to have, for example, translation, rotation, color shifts, opacity, different changes basically, so that you can animate your components, making a text fade in or out, making a button move, something along those lines. Proceeding from there, we have on the right details, which is very blank right now, so we'll bring in a component so you see what it looks like. So now we have a button selected over here, so that means that the details will fill up with the properties that we can put for a button. And there are a lot of properties available to us. There is things like anchors, which allows us to solidify the relative position of a component to a certain part of the screen. This is to allow your user interface to be sort of conforming similarly to different resolutions. So if you have something that's aligned to the top left, for example, and it would have this specific position, then it has a certain position in X and a certain position in Y, and it would try and use those positions to align itself on all different resolutions. So the higher resolution you would have, let me give you an example here. So you have these two buttons. If you have a lower resolution, and let's say that this button is anchored to the top middle, so that means that this one will try to stay in the top middle of the screen in relationship with its relative positions. So the lower resolution you have on your screen, the closer these ones will be between each other because there are less pixels to draw on the screen. And equally, the higher resolution you have on your screen, the further apart or the more space you would have between them because there are more pixels to draw. So let's remove those again. This interface that we've gone through right now is called the designer, but there's a whole other dimension to widget blueprints as well, and that is the actual blueprint part of it. And that one you reach by clicking the graph up here. So the graph brings us to an editor that looks very similar to the blueprints that we've been working with before, and they have a lot of similarities. They have events, they have variables, you can make functions, event dispatchers, macros, a lot of stuff. So they are basically a visual blueprint for you to work with that has a lot of benefits and makes it easier for you to make something visually representative on a screen for a player. Now that we have gone through the basics of it, let's go ahead and make a very simple widget HUD. Something that is very common for games is something like a health bar. A health bar can be made and done in a lot of different ways, but the most common way to do it is to use something called a progress bar. A progress bar is a component that allows you to have a background, which is the gray, and a color that can fill in this progress bar. The progress bar has a few properties like how it fills the bars. This decides the directionality of how your bar is going to fill in. To demonstrate this, we can put a value here for percent, which is actually the value that dictates how filled a progress bar will be. The value will go between 0 and 1, so 0 meaning 0% filled and 1 meaning 100% filled. So if we were to put a value of 0.5 here, you can see that our progress bar is filled to half. It is filled to half from left to right because that's our bar fill type. If we were to choose right to left, it would switch around. And you can have fill from center, top to bottom. You see you have a lot of options here. There are many other ways to be fancy about this and make something very unique and individual, but we will just be going through the basic functionality today. Now, this bar having a percent value here is all good and nice, but it can't work on its own. There's no immediate functionality done immediately when you have added a progress bar like this. This needs to be driven somehow by variables. The way to do this is, for most people, they would go and create a binding here. A binding is something that allows you to hook up. I'll show you. We create a binding here. We get a function created immediately. It gets a standard generated function name, which you can rename and call it something else. That's perfectly fine. And basically what you see here is it gets a return value. So this return value is what it expects to fill this percent with. How you fill this value can be done in a lot of different ways. One way, for example, is if you go to your character, your first person character, and you add something like a health variable. We'll change this to a float to make it easy for us to communicate with the UI, because that one is also using float as its type. We compile and save. You can then say that a player's health should be directly updating this value. An example of how you could do this is you right click here, you type get owning player. This will return the player that currently owns this HUD element, and you'll see in a moment why that works. However, what we get here is a player controller reference, and what we want is its actual pawn, the thing that is controlling. Get control pawn. This would give us the pawn that we have. However, our pawn doesn't know that it has a health because the health is in the first person character, so we need to cast this to a first person character. Now, some would do this, and I would say that this is a mistake. They would get the health here, they would set it over here, and to demonstrate how this works, we can set this value to 0.7, compile, save. We need to do one more thing before we can actually use the HUD though, and that is to actually add it to our viewport, as it's called. So if we were to move this, this is the begin play event. So this is at the start. So we will create a widget, and then we define which widget we want to create. So we use our WHUD. So now it has created the widget. Now what it needs to do is to add this to the viewport so we can actually see it. So we add viewport. Now when the character is created the first time, it will create the widget and then it will add it to the viewport. But before we can test this out, we need to clean some of this stuff up here. We don't need... We can remove all of this. We can remove the VR gun as well. This should be fine. Something like this. We don't need all the other stuff. And we also need to get player. So, okay, we need to get the play controller. There we go. Okay. How this works now is the player controller here is assigned this widget element and added to its viewport. That is how the HUD itself will know who the owning player is. Now when we press play, we get a little bar down here to the right. And that looks fine. It seems to be showing 70% like the value we added to the player. The problem is this. Many people would say to create a binding like this, and I disagree that that's a good idea. I think this is bad practice and I think it's bad to teach it. I think it's better to teach better ways to do things so that you learn not to do things that are mistakes. The best way for me to show you this is if we press play over here. You can see that we have the bar and you can see that it's very stationary. Nothing is happening. Nothing is affecting the health bar at all. So if we go back to the HUD and we go and say print health. Now this, let's just show it. Let's press play. You see that there's a lot of health being typed here. The reason for this is a create binding is called each frame. So it's basically like using the tick. And we have discussed how using the tick is a bad idea. We want to have our game driven by events. We want to have when the life is changed for some reason, like you pick up something that gives you life or you get shot by something and you decrease your life. When that happens and your life is actually changed, that is when we want to tell the widget you need to update. So if we go back to the widget and remove this print string, there are many ways to do this without using the binding like this. What we instead could do, let's remove this completely. And it doesn't like it because it still has remove binding. There we go. It still had a reference to having a binding created. It's just that it didn't know what the binding was anymore. Now this should be fine. So if we instead do something that we talked about earlier in the tutorial series, we can make an event here. Custom event, and we can call this health updated. Possibly even spell it better. This can be our event that tells us what our life is supposed to be. So we can say it should have an input that is health in percent, and we'll make it a float. And we go back to the designer, and what we do is we call this progress bar health bar. The name up here represent what the component is called. You can see that it also updates over here in our hierarchy. The reason why this is important is both for visibility to see what your components are called, but also if you choose to tick in the variable, it becomes available over here on the left for us. And having a good naming convention is good because it helps us see what our components are easily. So if we drag out our health bar here, and then we do set %, and the reason why we type that is because we know that the component or the variable here is called %. Type that like, connect it like so, and then we do that. Now we theoretically have an event that's set up for us to update the user interface whenever it were to have its health affected in some way. What we can do now is we can use our construct, which is the begin play for widgets. We can use that to set up some kind of relationship to an event dispatcher for us here. So if we go back to our first person character and we create a new event dispatcher, and we'll call this health updated, and we'll give it a parameter that's of the type float. We'll call this new health in %, like so. Then we need to somehow communicate that we have changed our health in some way. There happened to be an event called any damage. This is an event that is created by Epic, which is triggered at any time that you take any kind of damage. We can use this to say our health should be subtracted by the damage that's incoming. And then we set our health to be whatever it is after that subtraction has occurred. Now, once this has been done, we could call on our health updated here. Meaning anybody who subscribed to this event would get the dispatched event sent to them with the new health, the new health in %. To be able to do this though, we need to know what is the percentage health. So we need to have a max health. So if our current health is 0.7 here, let's say it was instead 35 or some other arbitrary number. And our max health we can set to something else like 150. Then what we would have as the health we want to have here is our current health divided by our max health. That will give us our health in %. And we can send that in there. Then we go back to our HUD again. Now we want the HUD to actually listen to this event. So we can do this by getting player. Get player pawn. And we cast it to first person character. Since the first person character has the health on it. And then we say health updated, and we say bind this event. Now drag out from the event, click add custom event, and we'll just do this. It has a different signature here, so we'll just do an exchange here real quickly so that it matches. Then we'll rename this health updated. Health update, compile and save. Okay, so theoretically now we have a situation where our character loses health by taking damage when that damage is done, we then say, hey, our health has been damaged. We want to update anybody who is interested, which is us because we told the player we were interested in beginning when the HUD was created. And then we'll call this event whenever that happens. And that means we update the health bar. So if we were to do the same thing here and print a string that says health and press play, you can see that our health bar is not moving and there's no health being typed out by the console. But that's partially because we're not taking any damage also. So if we go to the map and we search for pain causing volume. This is a volume that Epic has created to allow you to easily generate that any damage event that we spoke about earlier. And I don't know what it's set for as doing damage, but that doesn't really matter, I think. So let's just step into this. So we have this one. Let's say we place it over the T in template so we know where it is, because it's just a volume we can't see. Let's go to the details. Oh, there we see. 1 damage per second is what's going to be caused. Yeah, that'll be fine, I think. So let's play then and walk into our pain damage volume. Now you can see that health is being typed and our progress bar is being reduced every now and then here. So now our health widget is being driven by events instead of a binding. This is way more performant and a much better way of doing this, in my opinion. So let's go back to our HUD once more and the designer. Now we just created the most bare bone of widgets here. We created a progress bar and we didn't do anything to it, really. Some of the things we should keep in mind are, we would like to anchor this to some point. Like for example, down to the right. Or let's say we do it in the middle bottom. Now you might think, hey, it's a very weird position here. I don't want it over there, why didn't it align? Well, the reason is when you set an anchor, it sets its current position as an offset to the anchor you have. You can see that as your position X and Y over here. So if we were to reset our position X, which we can do by clicking the little yellow arrow here on the right, you can see that it goes to the middle. Well, now you might think, well, it's not aligned properly, it's starting from the middle and then going out right. And that is true. That has to do with alignment. Alignment are these values. Alignment X is the value that is currently making it look like it's going to the right. And this alignment means it is not aligned. It is aligned from the left, you can see it as. If you want to have it aligned in the center, you can type in 0.5 and you can see that it will center itself properly here. If you were to say 1 as alignment, it would have the rightmost corner as the alignment towards the point that you've anchored. So most of the time 0.5 value here will be good. Now when it comes to the Y value here, if we were to reset this, you can see that it would end up what's actually outside of the screen. Going with a 0.5 here won't do us much good because we would just see half the bar. Doing a 1 won't do us that much good either because it will be just at the bottom of the screen and that doesn't look very nice. So what you might want to do instead is you actually use this position Y to give it a value something like, let's say 200 pixels, but negative because positive is going downwards. So minus 200 here and you'll get it in this position. So anchors are important. Make sure that you have anchors to different places that are good reference points to where you would like to have your different UI elements on your screen. These supplementary parameters are also important, of course. Another Important one is the following. If you drag in a text, for example, and you type in a text that says, "Hello, I am making a game." And you see it is going outside the borders of this containment. This is no good. If you want it to automatically fit whatever content you have in it, and this works for more things than just text, you have this little checkbox here you can click in to make it encompass everything. So that one is also good to keep in mind. Other than that, you have a lot of options to play around with. You have things like style, progress, accessibility, appearance. This is, for example, where you would change what kind of a fill you would have on a color you would have on your fill bar. So since this is supposed to represent a health bar, red is usually a good color, right? Because that's what we're used to having. So we'll put 1 for R, 0 for G as in green, and 0 for blue, and we have red as our life. There are a lot of stuff here to tinker around with, and I won't go through all of it, but some other important things to keep in mind are visibility. This is where you can hide and show different elements according to your needs. We went through the progress part. Style is something that can be quite useful to making it look unique and nice. You can use images to get a certain feel for it. Also, when it comes to buttons, you can have styles which allow you to have different tints, for example, if you hover over a button, so you get some feedback to a player showing that you are hovering over the button. Let's see if we can make a tint here which shows this off a little bit. So if the blue color here is the hover, that means that when you have the button hovered over, it will be blue. It won't show here, so let's jump in and see if we can make it. See, you can get some feedback to the player about what is happening. So they have a more intuitive reaction to your user interface. Now let's create another bar. Let's create a bar for mana. Mana is a common used element as well. You can use another progress bar. You can choose to style it or make it as big as you want, and you can move it around here as you want. And the same thing applies for this. So you want to have it fill in a certain color, maybe dark blue, something like that. And then you have your percentage so you can see what that would look like. And in a similar way, you do not want to create a binding for the percent. You want to have it event driven. So that means that you would be going to your first person character, create another variable for mana and max mana, and then you'd go back here and you'd create events for keeping your mana updated in the same way. Yes. Now, widgets might look a little bit boring when you see the basic default look that they have, right? It's nothing super fancy. What I want you to keep in mind is here, me personally, I am not an artist. I'm not very good at making images and things like that to use as assets to give the widgets a certain flair. If you are prone to being a graphical person, an artist that is good with Photoshop, for example, or GIMP or any of those tools, then you will have an easier time spiffing these up, making them pretty. I want you to understand though that regardless if you are competent or not with making assets like this, you are able to make some pretty cool results if you just lend some time into learning how the different widgets can be tweaked and what you can do with them. Also small things like animations, like having your bar decrease. Let's say you have 100% health and then you get hit by something that does 30% of your life. You can code in something that does reduce your health bar to 70% when it comes to the red, but the remainder in here is filled in with yellow or something like that, that slowly decreases until it reaches the point where your health bar actually is or something. You can see this in games like Dark Souls and similar. There is a lot you can do with just small measures like that. So don't feel like the widgets are ugly or they're limiting. There is an ocean of opportunity here for a creative person to make stuff. Hopefully you found this video helpful. If you liked the video, leave a like. If you did not like it, leave a dislike. Leave any suggestions or comments down below. Subscribe if you want to see more videos like this in the future. In the next video, we will actually start to create something special. We will take everything that we have learned so far, put it together and start to create our first basic game. That is all for now. Keep on learning. Take care.